Oh, hang on.
I will just go Amy.
Are you ready? Huh?
Okay, morning. Let's send these around. Oh, you know what? Really, we should start the broadcast after we do attendance. It's a huge deal. What's that? Yeah, good idea. You do that so that way we don't have to do it on live video. Morning. How is everyone's Yom Tov season? Good? Good. Yeah. Okay. So we're back for some more Parsha. It's been a while. Okay, let's see how we go. So this week Parsha is Parshas Noach. It's one of the big stories of history, of the Bible, of Torah, which is the flood and the ark that Noach built. So we're actually going to look at something really interesting in this week's Parsha, and not so much the actual story of the flood itself, not the details of the flood, but something really fundamental about the whole picture and the whole story, what was happening, what was going on, why did things turn out the way that they did? Because this is obviously a very fundamental story. It's a fundamental story to all of mankind, not just to Jews. So we're going to get into this and have a look at what happened and try to understand why it happened. Let's start inside the text, I think, and we'll see how we go. Knowing myself will probably end up mostly outside of the text because that's usually how it goes, but let's start inside and take it from there. Thank you. Okay, so we're on page 7 in the copy. It looks like we only have Hebrew today, or is there English at the back? Oh, there is English at the back, okay. So in the English, it's page 13, 2 generations, 2 types of punishment. So I'm going to be reading in the Hebrew from Vav, halfway down, a bit more than halfway, probably 60% of the way down the left column on page 7 in the Hebrew. So when it comes to the generations between Noach and Avram, so there's a Mishnah that tells us there were 10 generations from Adam until Noach, from Adam, the first man, from creation until Noach and the flood. And then there were 10 generations from Noach till Avram. And about the 10 generations from Noach to Avram, the Mishnah says, we're on the 3rd line in the Hebrew, there were 10 generations from Noach till Avram. This is the second set of 10 generations since creation. Why were there 10 generations? To teach us how patient Hashem is. And all the generations between Noach and Avram, there were 10 generations of them making Hashem angry and behaving unacceptably. Until at the end, Hashem was patient and gave him 10 generations. And eventually, after 10 generations, Avram showed up and he got the reward, all the cumulative reward of the previous 10 generations, because they had not been able to get it because of their behavior. So there could already be a couple of questions showing up here, and we'll get to them. What reward did he get? How did they have reward if they weren't behaving? If they couldn't get the reward, then why did he get their reward? If he got their reward, that means they had a reward. Maybe they should have gotten it. We'll get there. We'll get to all of that. So v'tzarech bir, but now we're getting to something else first. V'tzarech bir, we need to understand. Oh no, we have the question right away. How did Avram get their reward if they were behaving unacceptably and making Hashem angry? And the only reason that Hashem let it go for 10 generations was to illustrate, to demonstrate his patience. So clear, presumably there was no reward that they deserved that Avram should have been able to collect on their behalf. So how was he collecting a reward on their behalf if they were behaving unacceptably? And the only reason Hashem let them continue was out of patience. But also Mishnah Lifneichen, so we're continuing now last 2 lines on page 7 in the Hebrew. In that same Mishnah earlier, the earlier in the Mishnah, so this quote about the 10 generations from Noach till Avram is not the beginning of the Mishnah, it's the middle of the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins, Asara Doros mi Adam ad Noach. There were 10 generations from Adam Harishon, from the first man until Noach, from creation until Noach. Lohaidia v'chulu, to tell us again about Hashem's patience, how much patience Hashem had. That Hashem was patient for 10 generations of unacceptable behavior. Hashem sat by and watched patiently and allowed it to continue and gave them a chance until eventually it came to Noach and he was like, that's it, we're done with the patience, wipe out basically the whole world with a flood, plants, animals, pretty much everything, including the top layer of soil, everything got wiped out with some animals that went in the ark so that they could restart again from fresh. V'kan, and here, Basar Doris, Ein Hamishna Mesemes Shenoach Kibul Schar Kula. It doesn't say there were 10 generations from Adam until Noach. Why? Because Hashem wanted to demonstrate his patience, that all the 10 generations were behaving unacceptably until Noach came and got the reward from all of them. It doesn't say that. By about the 10 generations from Adam till Noach, the first 10 generations, it says there were 10 generations from Adam till Noach to show Hashem's patience, that they were all behaving unacceptably until Hashem brought the Mabul and had enough and wiped them out. The next 10 generations from Noach till Avram, it says, it starts off the same, 10 generations from Noach to Avram, to show Hashem's patience, that for 10 generations they were behaving unacceptably until Avram came and got all of their reward. So there's clearly some very big differences here between the first 10 generations and the second 10 generations. The first 3/4 of the quote is basically the same with different names. 10 generations from Adam to Noach, 10 generations from Noach to Avram, to show the Hashem's patience, to show Hashem's patience, because they were behaving unacceptably, And then at the very end it says, until the generation of Noach, while Hashem brought the flood, or until Avram came and got all of their reward. So the question is, why the difference? There's clearly some sort of fundamental difference between let's say, the story or the journey of the first 10 generations versus the story and the journey of the second 10 generations, which is why even though the first 80% or so of the quote is basically the same, the ending is completely different and it seems almost opposite. One says until Hashem brought the flood, and one says until Avram collected all of their reward. So what's going on here? There's going to be some more information that isn't explicitly stated in the Mishnah that we need to have in order to understand how this all makes sense and why it is the way it is. So in the case of Noach, when it says there were 10 generations that were behaving unacceptably until Hashem brought the flood, that makes a lot of sense, right? They were behaving unacceptably for 10 generations. Finally, Hashem got fed up and said, that's it. I'm obviously, this is metaphorically speaking. But until Hashem's patience ran out, let's say, and Hashem says, that's it, it's time for the punishment, bring the flood. That seems to make a lot of sense. It's the Avram one that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. For 10 generations, they were behaving unacceptably, and Hashem should have never let it continue, but he did because he was patient, until Avram came and collected all of their reward. That seems really weird. In addition to seeming opposite to the story of Noach, which is in the 10 generations to Noach, which is in the same Mishnah, but seems to be opposite. So what's going on here? There are a whole bunch of things we need to figure out and clarify. Okay, so we're at the middle paragraph, right column on page 8 in the Hebrew. The Yuvan Behektim will understand this by prefacing Achiluk ben Der Hamabel, Shasiyam Bakolo Baseche Esasara Dosim Adam ad Noach. We'll understand this by first clarifying the difference between the generation of the Mabul, which was the culmination of the 10 generations until Noach, and what's known as the Der Hafloga, I'm going to clarify in a second, which is the culmination of the second set of 10 generations from Noach till Avram. Der Hafloga means the generation of the dispersal would probably be the most accurate way of translating it, at least in context. And what it refers to is this 20th generation. And just briefly, the story in Chumash is that they came along and they got together and said, well, 10 generations into existence, there was Hashem wiped out the world. So now we're 20 generations in, we're another 10 generations. Maybe this is like a cyclical thing that every 10 generations Hashem comes and wipes out the whole world. So let's rebel against Hashem. And so they built this huge tower, and they were going to build this tower and go and fight against Hashem. Whatever they were thinking. Go figure, but people have thought stranger things. So as a correction for this, as a punishment for this, a bit of both probably, Hashem spread them out all around the world, and and different languages, took away their ability to work together collectively as a people to rebel against Hashem. Because that's what they were doing. They're working together collectively as a team, the whole generation, to fight against Hashem. So Hashem said, okay, if this is what you're going to do with your unity, I'm going to prevent that. And Hashem then separated them and broke them up into different places and different languages, etc. So that's the Dor HaFlaga, the generation of dispersal. That was the 20th generation, 10 generations after Noach, 20 generations after Adam. So there are a lot that these two generations have in common. First of all, that's equivalent with Avram Avinu. That's the 10th generation from Noach, and that's the generation in which Avram came and got the reward of the previous 10 generations. So if we look at the generation of Noach versus the generation of the Dor HaFlaga, and the two stories, if we look at the whole stories, maybe we can get some insight into why the specific thing of Noach versus Avram and eradication of basically all of the world versus Avram receiving the reward. Maybe we can figure out what's going on if we look at the whole picture. Right? If you ever want to figure out something, if there's something that doesn't seem to make sense, it's a good idea to step back and say, let's look at the bigger picture, see what's going on. And the more we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the more chance we give ourselves to see different things that might have an impact, that might make a difference, right? When a person goes to a doctor with an issue, a good doctor will generally ask questions. And a lot of the questions will seem random. And it's like, well, I came in with a sore throat. Why are you asking me about who knows what? Right? But a doctor, if they're doing their job correctly, hopefully they understand how the body works and how different parts of the body work together and different systems interact with each other, and generally speaking, any symptom could result from a number of different conditions or different situations. And a good doctor is going to ask a bunch of questions to try to clarify, to eliminate different possibilities and to clarify and figure out exactly what's going on, right? When you have the big picture, the more details we have, the more effectively we can generally figure out what's going on and then clarify different details specifically. So we're trying to figure out why, in the case of Noach, after the 10 generations of patience, Hashem wiped everything out. In the case of Avram, after 10 generations of patience, Avram collected this reward that apparently they had accumulated, even though they'd been behaving unacceptably and required Hashem's patience to continue existing. So let's zoom out, look at the whole story. And after looking at the whole story, hopefully we'll have a little bit more perspective with which we can understand these specific details. Make sense? Yeah? Okay, so let's do that. It's good that you said yes, because if you would have said no, we were going to continue anyway. Was there a question?
No? Nice.
I never said that I was going to be nice. Okay, anyways, before this escalates. Okay, so now we're at the bottom paragraph, right column, page 8 in the Hebrew. When it comes to these two generations, the generation of the flood and the generation of the dispersal, i.e. generation of Noach and generation in the time of around Avram, we find a couple of things that are not only different, but seem to be diametric opposites. When it comes to the punishment, the physical punishment during the conscious human experience in the physical world, the punishment of the generation of the flood was much bigger than the punishment of the generation of dispersal. The generation of the flood just got completely eliminated. They were gone, just wiped out everything, which is a much bigger punishment than the Dor HaFlaga, which was just spread out. Like being spread out and, having difficulty communicating with people you used to be able to communicate with, like that could get pretty messy, but it's not the same as like everyone just not being there anymore at all, right? So when it comes to the physical punishment during life, during physical life, the punishment of the generation of the flood was way harsher than the punishment of the generation of dispersal. In contrast, when it comes to the spiritual punishment, the punishment that the soul would have experienced once it was no longer in the body, when it comes to the generation of dispersal, it is stipulated clearly and unequivocally that they had no world to come, no olam haba. Their souls did not experience any reward after the end of life. That was it. When it comes to the generation of the flood, the generation of Noach, there's a lot of discussion and debate about whether or not they had their souls experienced a reward after the end of life, the extent of it, etc. So spiritually, the generation of dispersal had no spiritual reward. That was it. They had the ultimate spiritual punishment, which is nothing. As opposed to the generation of the flood, that it's not that simple, and there's a lack of clarity as to how definitively they were punished spiritually.
This first was Avram's generation?
Yes, the Dor HaFlaga, correct. So now this is a really important thing that we need to understand before we're going to get some answers here. Hopefully, it's already understood to a degree, but there are some people who incorrectly claim that, well, I guess it's a matter of terminology. We'll say, heaven and hell are Christian ideas. They don't exist in Judaism. Judaism doesn't believe in heaven and hell. I mean, it doesn't say the word hell anywhere in Torah, but there's Gehenna, there's reward and punishment, there is afterlife, and there's like the positive afterlife experience and the negative afterlife experience. These are Jewish concepts. The thing is that there are two, not competing, but two concurrent things that are happening here with, Gan Eden, Olam Haba, heaven, and Gehenna, and the opposite. First of all, it is a reward and a punishment, right? When Rambam talks about the 13 fundamental principles of Jewish faith, one of them is the principle of reward and punishment. This whole thing is real, our actions matter, and there is real reward and punishment that results from our choices and from our actions. But that's only really, and I'm saying this in my own words, probably the less important and to a degree relatively trivial part of the picture. Obviously it's not trivial, it's fundamental, but it's the more superficial element of the picture. The more, I don't want to say real, but the more, I have to figure out the word, but the deeper, let's say, part of this picture is that these are the outcomes of our actions. Our actions have outcomes. If, for example, and this is like a very simple and maybe to a degree a bit of a comical analogy, but it's very effective. It makes the point clearly, I think. If someone you want to cook something or bake something, I'm going to go with baking, I think, just because baking is more technical and more sensitive than cooking. It's easier to completely destroy something when you're baking than to completely destroy something when you're cooking. You're cooking, you mess up something a little, be a little bit stronger flavor, a little bit less, a little bit thicker, a little bit more viscous, a bit less. When you're baking, if you mess up your wet and dry ingredients, you mess something up, you have nothing to work with at the end. You have no product. And let's say you have a recipe, I don't know, challah, yeast recipes until you get the hang of them can be very delicate and sensitive. You have a new bread recipe, sourdough, maybe it's even more so. And there's a recipe in a book or on a blog, and you follow the recipe to a T, generally speaking, you end up with the product that you are hoping to end up with. Is that a reward? It's like the person who wrote the recipe book said, I want you to follow this recipe, and if you follow this recipe as a reward, you're going to get a nice product at the end. And that's not how it works. The way it works is that if you want to have this product, this is the way that you go about making the product. The outcome of getting the correct ingredients and following the correct method with those ingredients is that process produces a good product. It's not a reward, it's an outcome. You literally generated and created the product through the process. And if the process is correct, then the product is likely to be good. If the process is incorrect, unless you get super lucky, the product is likely to not be as good. Right? So the process, the actions that you engage in when you're preparing this food determine what happens. You've literally generated the outcome. So it's the same thing here. Our actions are real and they matter. And, now let's take this a step further and use a second analogy. I think that first one is important. The second one's going to add a bit of a different angle to it, which is going to take us in the direction of understanding reward and punishment and Gan Eden and heaven versus Gehenna. No, you know what? It's not going to work. But point being, our actions generate a real outcome. There's this idea. There's another Mishnah also in Pirkei Avos. Schar mitzvah mitzvah. The reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. What does it mean? Schar mitzvah mitzvah. The reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. And there are a number of different things that it means. There are many layers to it, all of which are true. There are different angles and different depths of going beneath the surface. One of the things that it means is that schar mitzvah, the reward of a mitzvah, the reward of doing the right thing, is not so much a reward as an actual technical outcome of the mitzvah itself. The reward of the mitzvah is actually a part of the mitzvah because the mitzvah generates the positive outcome. Now, we have to understand what reward means, because reward can be used in a number of can mean subtly different things, right? When you say something is very rewarding, this activity is rewarding, this project, this pursuit is rewarding. When you say that it's rewarding, you don't mean that someone's giving you a reward at the end, but it also does mean that you get a sense of reward at the end because it is something that will give you a positive experience, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's our experience that matters more than anything. And what I mean by that is, for example, without trying not to get, too carried away and too deep out in the weeds, for the perspective, for example, perspective is important. Perspective is one of the most important things in life, and it's probably the most valuable investment we could ever make I'm not talking about even spiritually and ideally, the most valuable investment we could make in our own quality of life and our lived experience is probably, and if it's not number one, it's up there in the top few, is working on upgrading our perspective and the way we perceive things. Because, I'm sure all of us know some people who are more negative and some people who are more positive. And a person who has a negative perspective and sees things negatively can have incredibly fortunate things happen to them and they just see the negative in it. And the outcome of that is that something good can happen to them and they end up actually having a bad experience as a result because of the way they perceive it. Now, just to clarify, that could sound like it's a matter of blame. It's not necessarily. We're born with different tendencies and different personalities and different perspectives. It's something that we can work on, but we have different natures. And there are people who just have a very positive outlook, whether they were born with it, whether they worked on it, whether it's a combination of both. And no matter what happens to them, they're smiling and not just putting on a show, but they actually see the good in things and have a positive personal experience as a result. So the thing that determines that the main thing that caused, this first person to have a negative experience and the second person to have a positive experience is their perception, right? So does it really matter that something good happened to the first person and something bad happened to the second person? No, it's irrelevant, because ultimately the first person had a bad experience anyway, and the second person had a good experience anyway, right? So the ultimate reward, what's the point of giving someone a reward? The point of, let's say with a kid, the point of, incentivizing a kid and giving them a prize, a treat, a candy, whatever it is, the point of that is that it makes them feel good, so it encourages them to do good things. Right? But the real reward, if you think about it deeply, the reward's not the candy. The reward is the sensation they experience inside when you give them the candy, right? That's the ultimate reward. It's just that for a little kid, a candy or a treat or a prize is a means by which you can give them that experience of feeling rewarded. Make sense? So ultimately, the reward is the experience, is the thing we feel, the sensation. And there are many things that generate that naturally, right? Putting in effort to do something constructive and to actually generate a positive outcome is rewarding. It will give you a reward. Not because someone says, oh, you worked so hard, I will give you a reward. It generates its own reward. There's a positive outcome, something good that happens that is rewarding, that makes you feel good, that makes you feel better than any treat or anything else ever could. Generally, the most deeply fulfilling and rewarding experiences that we have are the outcomes of putting in effort and investing in doing something constructive and making a positive difference for ourselves, for other people, doing something hard, learning something new, making a difference. These things give us far greater sense of rewardedness inside, which is ultimately the real reward. A reward you give someone is really a means by which you hope to make them feel rewarded inside. And some of the greatest sensations of being rewarded come just as a result of what we do. So what we do, right? So here again, the actions are generating their own reward. It's the same thing, schar mitzvah, the outcome, the reward of a mitzvah. It's not like Hashem sitting there and saying, oh, you did a mitzvah, I'm so proud of you, here's a reward. It's not to take away from that. I'm not saying that that concept and idea doesn't exist. But the primary thing that's happening here is that the reward, the schar mitzvah, the outcome of the mitzvah, the reward of the mitzvah is actually something that's generated by the mitzvah itself. Mitzvah also means connection. When we fulfill mitzvahs, we connect to Hashem. We connect to infinity. We become one with divinity. And that's where this Gan Eden, the Olam Haba, this experience of heaven comes from. It's something we're actually generating through our actions. Every mitzvah we do, every bit of Torah we learn, every time we help someone, it's a mitzvah, tzavsa. We're connecting to Hashem. We're becoming one with divinity and with infinity. We just don't experience it consciously now. Right now, it's behind the surface. When a soul leaves a body and passes on, the soul gets to experience all of that which it generated and achieved throughout its life. So that's schar mitzvah. The reward of the mitzvah is actually an outcome of the mitzvah itself, not something that someone's giving, right? And that just makes it so much more real and deep and powerful and meaningful and rewarding. It's much more rewarding, back to, the many angles of reward and rewarding. It's much more rewarding to have a reward that's a natural outcome of what you did than someone giving you a reward because they decided that they wanted to give you a reward. So, the satisfaction that we get out of working really hard and facing a challenge and a difficult challenge and beating it and doing what we set out to do is so much deeper and more powerful and just rewarding than someone saying, oh, I'm so proud of you, here's a prize. You can't compare. So, and it's the same thing here that we need to understand, right? The punishment of the generation of the flood is opposite to the punishment of the generation of dispersal, the Der HaFlaga. Now, if punishments are real, and we're saying, so we focus primarily on reward, but it's the same for punishment, right? And this is something that, is a very important thing in education, in teaching children in school, teaching children at home, teaching people who you manage, who work for you, teaching people who you help, who you coach, who you're trying to, just help out in life. It can be a very hard thing to help someone learn when you care about them. Because when you really care about someone, you want them to feel good, you want them to have positive experiences. But sometimes some of the most helpful things we can do for someone are to allow them to learn by way of real life that there are outcomes for their actions, not only positive, but negative. And when a person doesn't step up to their responsibilities, there are negative outcomes for them and they will end up losing out. Right. And sometimes the best favor we can do for someone is allow them to experience it and to be there and to support them through it but without minimizing it and trying to take it away. When we try to cover it up and say, it's not really your fault, if it really is, we're not actually helping them, because all we're doing is causing that it's going to happen again. And they're going to end up feeling bad again, right? That sometimes some of the biggest favors we can do for someone are allow them to learn the hard way. It doesn't mean we don't support them and be there for them, but we can support someone through something without trying to prevent it or protect them from it. And by allowing them to learn, we allow them to ultimately, and this is something I say a lot when I talk about, this, particularly in the context of a parent, it's also true of a teacher, but ultimately, especially when you're dealing with children, it's not only children, it's true of adults too, helping adults, is, when you care about someone, you want them to feel good now. That's just the way it is. But sometimes we have to stop and ask ourselves, what's in this person's best interest? Is it in this person's best interest that I should make a decision now that will help them smile and feel good now? Or is it in this person's best interest that I should decide to behave towards them in a way that they're not going to smile now and they're not going to feel good now, but it's going to lead to 1,000 smiles and occasions of feeling good over the course of the next 100 years? Right? Because sometimes a lesson learned the hard way ends up resulting in a lot more smiles and a lot more positive experiences over a long period of time. And this has to be understood properly, because it's not saying that we should go out of our way to make people's lives difficult. One thing that's guaranteed is everybody's life is going to give them more than enough opportunities. What we have to figure out, if we really want to help someone, is when is it time to intervene, and when is it time to say, you know what, this is going to be a learning experience. I'm going to let this person learn this the hard way, which is going to teach them that their actions have outcomes. And if they are prepared, if they are responsible and step up to the plate, it will make their life better. And if they don't, they will experience the cost of that and the negative outcome. And I will support them through it, but I'm not going to minimize it and take it away from them. And that way they will learn, and they'll end up having a much better quality of life over the next 100 years, or however many years it is. Why is that? The reason that this is an important thing, to know when you want to help someone is because not stepping up to our responsibility has negative outcomes. It causes negative things in our life. It's not just a punishment, right? If you care about someone, you're not saying, well, you misbehaved, so now I'm going to let you suffer. That's what you say to someone you don't care about. If it's someone that you care about, you would like to protect them from the negative outcome. But the fact is, if this person has a life ahead of them, they're going to have decisions to make, and they're going to have difficult decisions to make, and they're going to have responsibilities. And the sooner they learn that by stepping up to their responsibilities, they end up better off, the better off they're going to be. Why? Because the decisions they make have real immediate outcomes and have real long-term outcomes. The decision determines the outcome. It's not a punishment. It's an outcome. There's a big difference. So because reward and punishment, heaven and Gehenna, Gan Eden and Gehenna, Olam Haba and Gehenna, whatever we want to call them, all these terms are to a degree at least synonymous. It is a reward and a punishment, but it's not really, their true identities are not reward and punishment. They're the outcomes of our actions. And the punishments and Gehenna and whatever it is, whatever the punishments are, generally, they're a cleansing process / correction. Question? Okay, so not necessarily does everyone go to Gehenna for a year, but a year, no. What you're saying comes from something. I just want to clarify. It's not like this is made up. No. That's based on something. So generally, everything has exceptions, but generally as a rule, the maximum amount of time any soul spends in Gehenna is 12 months. Now, we don't know how much time someone's soul is going to spend in Gehenna, but we know that it's definitely not more than 12 months. Now, what this relates to is when it comes to Avelos and mourning and the year of mourning, there are different stages in mourning. There's 7 days, there's Shiva, there's Shloshim, 30 days, there's a year. And then there's the fact that people who are mourning say Kaddish, right? It's a special tefillah that people say in shul. People think that it addresses the neshama. It doesn't address the neshama at all. It's just an incredibly powerful praise and prayer about Hashem. And it's said in the merit of the soul of the departed, which helps give it, helps reinforce and strengthen it in its journey. Specifically through Gehenna is the primary focus. Now, because we don't know how much time any given soul is spending in Gehenna, we want to say Kaddish for the whole time, just to make sure. Hopefully no one that we know or that we have known who ever passed away would have spent that much time there, but we don't know, and we don't want to start differentiating and figuring out how much yes and how much no, because we don't know. So we just do that amount. Now, we don't actually do it for a year. We do it for 11 months. Because we don't want to assume that anyone's going all the way to 12. It's like 12 is like hardcore maximum. That's like, that's like life sentence, the equivalent. That's the maximum sentence. And that's like for really, 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 I wouldn't say bad people, but for people who live really, 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 really incorrect lives, let's say. So we definitely don't want to, it's kind of a bit of a dancing on both sides of the fence. And like, we don't want to make it look like this person could possibly conceivably have gotten 12 months. So we don't say Kaddish for 12 months, we say it for 11, but we don't want to do less than 11 because we want to make sure we cover all our bases. So that's probably where that comes from. It's not that everyone goes for 12 months, it's that 12 is the maximum that anyone would go for. So we want to cover that and we go up to 11 months for everyone. Make sense? So it's true that Gan Eden and Gehenna, the world to come, and the negative equivalent of that, are a reward and a punishment. But that's not primarily what they are. They're outcomes. The reward of this is the schar mitzvah. The reward is something that we've actually generated. It's the outcome of following the recipe. Mitzvahs connect to Hashem. Torah study connects to Hashem. It makes us become more deeply and strongly connected to Hashem. And then after the soul leaves the body, it gets to experience all of that connection that it generated, which is ultimately what Gan Eden is, what the experience of heaven, of Olam Haba is. And if someone is, every time someone behaves in a way that they should not be behaving, according to Torah, they create barriers between themselves and Hashem, and they, let's say, they dirty, they damage their soul to a degree. The actual soul itself deep down is cannot be damaged. But it gets the outward connection to Hashem gets damaged and gets reduced and gets impurified, let's say. And impurified, that's probably not a word. Contaminated. Impurity is a word. I don't think impurified is a word. Gets contaminated. And the outcome of that is that it needs to be cleansed. Just random analogy that just popped into my head, right? If anyone who takes clothes to the dry cleaners a lot will know that especially, sensitive fabrics, they get damaged by dry cleaning over time. They get worn out. They lose or they get too much of a sheen maybe, but they don't end up looking the way that they're supposed to. And it doesn't take a whole lot of dry cleaning to damage sensitive fabric. So, which tells you that the process of dry cleaning is actually not good for the fabric. It takes a toll on the fabric, generally. That being said, if an item of clothing is dirty and it's dry clean only, you want it to be clean, you have to dry clean it. Right, so Gehenna is ultimately a process of cleansing, of correction. And if something got messed up, right, I don't know, let's say that someone spills something on the floor, makes a massive mess on the floor. That mess needs to be cleaned up. It's not a punishment. Just like there's a mess, and if you want the floor to be clean, you got to clean it. It's that simple. Now, is it fun cleaning floors? Most people don't enjoy cleaning the floor, which means that effectively it may also end up serving as a punishment for spilling something on the floor if it's in an instance in which it's deserving of punishment. But the reason that the floor needs to be cleaned is not as a punishment. It's because the floor got dirty and needs to be cleaned. So that's primarily what's going on here, is that the floor is dirty and needs to be cleaned. Secondarily to that, it just so happens that this may also effectively serve as a punishment. But that's not what it's about. The cleaning of the floor is not coming as a punishment. It's coming as an outcome of the floor being dirty. So it's the same thing here. This process that the neshama goes through, the reward and the punishment, they are a reward and a punishment, but they're not primarily coming. It's not like Hashem said, oh, you did this, here's the reward. You did that, here's a punishment. We actually generate the reward and the punishment through our actions. The reward and the punishment are real, and they're proportional, and they're connected. Right? If someone spills something on the floor, you don't say, oh, the walls need to be washed because something got spilled on the floor. No, something got spilled on the floor. Why do the walls need to be washed? Right? So let's say that you walk into a room and you're blindfolded, and you know that someone just spilled something and you don't know where they spilled it, and someone says, okay, now you need to clean the floor. You now know that where did they spill something? On the floor, not on the walls. If they say you now need to clean the walls, you know that they spilled something on the walls, not on the floor. Why? Because it's not a random punishment. That thing which is also effectively serving as a punishment, which is you need to clean the walls or you need to clean the floor, is primarily just because they made a mess and it needs to be cleaned up. So the punishment is always going to match the thing that caused the punishment, because it's not really a punishment primarily. Primarily, it's correcting the thing that went wrong, which also incidentally happens to serve as a punishment. Right? So you should be able to, from the punishment, or the thing that the person is being told they now need to do, you should be able to figure out what they did wrong, which is why they need to do such and such a thing to correct it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Question?
You said if you spilled something, it ends up on the floor, but sometimes it does end up on the walls, and you don't know where it ends up.
Right. So that at first, that was before I developed it further. So at first I was just thinking about the floor. Why do you need to clean the floor? Because you spilled something on the floor. And then as it developed, you're right, it was like, well, it may not be the floor, it may be the walls. And that's why if you spill something on the walls, you need to clean the walls. If you spill something on the floor, you need to clean the floor. So when I said if you spill something, it ends up on the floor, I meant like if you just spill something straight down. And if that's what happens, then the floor needs to be cleaned. Something splatters on the wall, then the wall needs to be cleaned, not the floor. Right. If it's both, then both.
Right. Like when you do something bad, like let's say I made her mad, like whatever. They didn't just make her mad, I made all her friends mad. So they're the walls and she's the floor.
If it splatters everywhere, yes. Which can definitely happen.
So when a soul comes down on earth with a specific mission, specific fate, do you think that depending on the experiences that person will gather and or good deeds, is it like GPS where if you take a different route, it like recalibrates to give you to bring you to your destination? Or do you think that sometimes people are destined to do all these averot, so that then the rectification from Garam is the only thing that can help them, basically? They're
definitely the first one.
Okay.
And the truth is that actually next week's Parsha in Lech Lecha, there's a sikha that we're definitely not going to be learning. It's it's one of the most difficult sikhas to really get. And that's pretty much the topic. And it's the balance between whatever, without getting too carried away. Basically, the idea is that we always have choice in certain things. We don't have as much choice as we might expect. But anytime it comes to a decision between right and wrong, we do have choice. Now, we have a mission and a purpose and something to achieve, which means Hashem wants us to achieve that thing. Which means it's not possible for us to do something at any point in our life which could prevent that from being achieved categorically. That would mean we're doing something that Hashem doesn't want to be possible. What it does mean is that there's the correct pathway to do what Hashem, to achieve that goal. And then there are many incorrect pathways that Hashem doesn't want us to take. But if we do head out on those incorrect pathways, there is always a way to get back to the goal. So every pathway, it's always recalibrating. There is always a way back, always. There's no such thing as a person who cannot do teshuvah. Doesn't exist. In Judaism, it does not exist that there's a person who cannot do teshuvah. There are times when it will say Hashem doesn't give you the chance to do teshuvah, which means Hashem's not going out of his way to facilitate and make it easy. But if you do it, if you step up and say, I'm going to do it, and I don't mean any of you, because no one here would ever do something like that, but there's no such thing as a person who cannot do teshuvah. So no matter how way off the beaten path we are, it's always recalibrating and there's always a path back. Sometimes the path back isn't easy and it may be long, but there's always a path back.
But does our spiritual makeup at birth, like our midos, does that take away, does that make choice kind of an illusion if we're like, we only have the tools?
Oh boy, you're going so deep. What I would say, honestly, if you want to really go all the way, like all the way, our midos, our personality, our character at birth, combined with our experiences, if you're looking at things purely biologically and physically, yes, it's true. That choice is ultimately an illusion, because decisions that we make, the making of a decision in the brain is ultimately a neurochemical process that is a result of, you know, the environment in the neurons and whatever's there and whatever experiences that those neurons have accumulated over the course of their lives. So as far biologically speaking, and it's interesting because this is like a big debate. There are a lot of the big podcasters sort of debate this. And a lot of the popular big ones are like, no, there's choice, there's no purpose without choice. And there's one particular one, is Jewish, an atheist, surprise. And he argues adamantly that there's no choice and everything is deterministic. What's surprising is that I agree with him. If you're just talking biologically, if you don't believe in God, if someone believes that there's just physical and there's no spirit and there's no God and there's no soul, then as far as I can see, you have to believe that ultimately true agency is a fallacy. It's imaginary. We make choices, but they're not free choices. They're choices that are the outcome of our nature and our experiences. It's not really truly choice. That's what he says. And I agree with him. I think that Sam Harris. But I agree with him in the context of looking at things purely physically and biologically. It's true. And in Torah, there's something that's called Bechira Chavshis, free choice. But then there's something that's called Bechira Amitis, true choice. That's true agency. Because most of the choices and the decisions we make are not true agency. It's imaginary agency. It feels like agency, but it's not really. Bechira Amitis, true agency, means that when it comes to a decision between right and wrong, and here's the thing, true agency shouldn't exist naturally. True agency only exists because Hashem wants us to have the opportunity to choose between right and wrong. And this is why, you know, in a lot of texts, you'll see, Rambam says that among others, that the place where we have true choice is only between right and wrong, between mitzvah and avera. When a person chooses, should I turn right or should I turn left? Did they make a choice? Yeah, they made a choice. As a human who has a certain nature and certain tendencies combined with certain experiences which create a certain environment in their brain cells, this is the decision that brain made, but it's not actually agency. So I don't know if you're familiar with the word, when you say something's a chiddush, it's a word of like, it's a bit of a, you know, a yeshivish sort of word. It means something new, the novelty. That's the word, novelty. True choice is actually a novelty. It's not something that should physically exist. It's a novelty that we have because Hashem wants us to choose between right and wrong, and we have a godly soul and an animal soul and all these things. So Bechira Amitis, true agency, only exists when deciding between morally right versus morally wrong, halachically right versus halachically wrong, etc. All the other decisions that we make are not true agency.
What was that word?
Bechira Amitis.
But the other one.
Bechira Chavshis. Generally, people say Bechira Chavshis, which means free choice. And it's not to say that Bechira Chavshis isn't Bechira Amitis. It just depends at what level of resolution, how zoomed in and how highly focused are we talking. Because we can differentiate between free choice, which isn't true agency, and free choice that is true agency. This is one of my favorite things. So I could talk about this for hours, but yeah. So you're right if we're looking biologically, the chiddush, the novelty is that Hashem gave us the ability to despite that, to actually have true agency, but that only applies when it's specifically right versus wrong, as opposed to just two options, neither of which is morally or halachically more right than the other one. That's choice, but it's not true agency. That's just an outcome of our nature combined with our experiences.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now, as usual, this is probably going to happen every week, that we'll have 5 minutes left and 3/4 of the discussion still to go. Okay, so we have to understand the difference. So now, point being, and we've really covered some fundamental things, and I don't regret it. We've covered some really important ideas. Reward and punishment are primarily an outcome of what we do, which means you should be able to see in the reward, you should be able to see what it's a reward for. In the punishment, you should be able to see what it's a punishment for. So the reward and punishment, or the punishment of Noach's generation versus Avram's generation, were opposites. At least the trend is opposite. Noach's generation had the ultimate physical punishment with a lesser spiritual punishment. Avram's generation had the ultimate spiritual punishment with a lesser physical punishment. So what's going on here? The question is, what were they doing wrong? Right? Their misdeeds and misactions were both severe, but they were in different categories. Avram, the Der Haflaga, Avram's generation rebelled against Hashem. They worked together. They worked in unison. They actually exemplified the ultimate teamwork in building this thing together, a whole generation working together on a project. I try to imagine that today. Good luck. Not on Twitter, that's for sure. Right? Try to imagine that today, a whole generation of people working together with a common goal. That's what they did. It's just that common goal was literally fighting Hashem. So that's not so good. But in terms of their interaction as a society, it was actually phenomenal. It's just that the thing towards which they were interacting together phenomenally was ultimately the worst thing of opposing Hashem. Noach's generation was kind of the opposite. Noach's generation, they were stealing, they were raping. Noach's generation, the primary category of misdeeds was dysfunctional as a society, not respecting each other, not treating each other properly. So as opposed to, now obviously all of those things are wrong as far as Hashem is concerned, but the generation of Noach, their primary thing wasn't direct ideological opposition to Hashem. It was just dysfunction as society, not working together. So because Noach's generation's primary sin was as a society in this world, that's where they really went wrong. The primary punishment, where they got the ultimate punishment, was as a society in this world. That society got eliminated. They weren't opposing Hashem. It wasn't an ideological opposition to Hashem. And so spiritually, they didn't get the ultimate punishment. Because their primary problem was as a physical society in this world, when it comes to the physical experience in this world, they got the ultimate punishment. The Der Haflaga, the generation of the dispersal, Avram's generation, was the opposite. As far as a society, functioning as a society is concerned, they were phenomenal. When it comes to spiritually, that's where their real sin was. They literally set out to oppose Hashem. So when it comes to the spiritual punishment, they got the ultimate punishment. When it comes to the punishment in this world, they got a far lesser punishment. They didn't get wiped out. They got separated and messed up a little, but not the ultimate punishment. So this is why the punishments are opposite, because in terms of the category, their misdeeds were opposite. And that punishment is an outcome of the behavior. So it makes sense that there's going to be a relationship between the outcome and behavior. Opposite categorization of misdeeds will result in an opposite punishment. Make sense? So now we've got to get back to figure out this whole Adam and Noach thing and the punishment. Adam and Noach. Noach versus Avram. Why was Avram accepting the reward for people who'd been behaving so badly? They shouldn't have had a reward. They were behaving so badly that the only reason they continued to exist was because Hashem's patience. And then Avram collected their reward. What reward? And so the answer is this. Noach's generation, they were a dysfunctional society. They might not have opposed Hashem, but they were just all around bad people. Not all around bad people. Bad people is wrong. And not because everyone's a good person, but because when you say someone's a bad person, in a way, what you do is you reduce their responsibility for what they do. At least it can come across that way. Someone's a bad person, it's not their fault, they're a bad person, right? Then you do a disservice to how badly someone behaved when you write them off as a bad person, right? But they were people who were just all around behaving badly, dysfunctional society. They hadn't accumulated any reward. The generation until the later generations, the Dur HaFloga, the generation of the dispersal, they were a functioning society. They had a lot of good things going for them. It's just that they really messed up. So they weren't able to get the reward, but there was some reward that had been generated. It's just that they weren't able to access it because they opposed Hashem, they fought Hashem. So all the positivity that they generated as a functioning and society, and a society that had unity, which generates a lot of positivity, because they opposed Hashem, they were prevented from accessing the positivity that they had generated as a functioning and coherent society. And so then a couple of things. Number one is they had the generations till Noach hadn't generated any positivity. They were a dysfunctional society that just didn't work together and didn't respect each other. That they hadn't generated anything positive for Noach to collect on their behalf. And second of all, what did Noach do? When Hashem told him there's going to be a flood, you should go. Well, at first he didn't really believe, wasn't sure. But then when the rain started coming, he packed up and he ran. He packed up, he got in the ark and he locked the door and sailed away. What happened when Hashem told Avram that there was going to be punishment, that people were going to be punished? Avram started davening on their behalf. Avram started begging Hashem, please, surely there are a few good people in the city. No, not that many. Maybe there's less. Someone, can't we find some sort of credit to save them? So two things happened here. Number one is that they were a functioning society that worked together and had mutual respect. And in some ways exemplified a functioning and mutually respectful society. So there was a lot of positivity that they had generated, but because they opposed Hashem, they were barred from accessing it, let's say. But the positivity had been generated. It was available for the collecting, let's say. And the thing that released that positivity and allowed it to be collected, was that Avram actually begged on their behalf. Avram represented them. Avram showed up and said, you know what? Yes, I'm good. My behavior is good and theirs isn't. I'm not just going to sail away and save myself. I'm going to beg Hashem to protect them. I care about them. Avram was the archetype of kindness, of caring, of giving. And that caring and concern and giving nature is what unlocked that positivity that they had generated and allowed it to be accessed. So ultimately, he was the one who ended up experiencing it. Why? Because again, reward is not just reward. It doesn't make sense to reward someone for what someone else did. Reward is secondarily a reward, but primarily the outcome of what we do. And they had done a lot of good things, which generated a lot of positivity and a lot of reward. It wasn't accessible to them. When Avram came and prayed for others, that unlocked the reward and made it accessible, and he ended up being the one who experienced it. And just a couple of lessons here, something that's really powerful for us today. Look around. I mean, I don't want to be Debbie Downer, first of all, just because it's not true. Like, the world we live in today is the best. There's no one from any point in history previously, except for maybe like a couple years ago, but even since then. But people are like, oh, life is so much negativity now. It's like, yeah, try living 100 years ago and see whether you'd complain about living now. Try living in a time when you had to work 12 hours a day in the field from the age of 6 years old if you wanted a slice of bread and a cup of water to have, and to hope you don't get eaten alive by some animal while you're out working in the field. Okay, don't complain to me about the world. We're very blessed to live in the best time that has ever existed since the universe came into existence. That being said, there's a lot of negativity and a lot of, not good stuff that goes around. And the lesson here from Avram is that, it's not Noach's generation. Everybody, there's an expression that says, "Afilu poshi yisrael meleim mitzvos kamirmin." Even people who are the ultimate sinners, they still have good things that they've done. There's still positivity that everybody has generated. And if we could just find it in ourselves to care about people, to look out, to be concerned, to care about their best interests, to pray for them, to try to help enlighten them and to help them figure things out and become more open-minded and to see the truth of Hashem and Torah and mitzvahs, and to give them that opportunity, what we can do is we can unlock all the positivity that they have already generated, right? The generation of dispersal, they generated the positivity, they never got to experience it because it was never unlocked while they were there. Avram unlocked it and it ended up on him. But if we can give, every time we open someone's mind to this and we enlighten them and give them the opportunity to connect to Hashem and to Torah and mitzvahs, what we're ultimately doing is giving them the opportunity to collect all the positivity that they have generated through the good things that they have done. Because everyone's done a lot of good things. There's no lost case, and every time we help someone, we're giving them the opportunity to collect and to experience all the positivity that they have generated, and to allow all of that positivity that everyone has generated to be collectively collected by us as a whole, and to help bring to the ultimate positive outcome, which is Mashiach. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you. And